specifically in the world of Grenache and the style you expect and what can be done in South Australia, Barossa specifically. Obviously, Old Vine plays a part, but what's the rest of the story? Why are we underrating Grenache here when we shouldn't be, of what is there to find?
I've often wondered the same. I've often wondered the same thing, right? So why has, from an Australian point of view, why has Shiraz become the hero when Grenache has been there side by side all that time? And I'm not sure I know the answer, but I've thought about it a bit. So, for decades, the wines out of the Barossa and the wines from Yalumba, we would talk about a Yalumba Burgundy. Mm-hmm. Or a Yalumba claret, and the clarets were the wines that were more full-bodied, more tannic. In our case, usually a Cabernet-based Cabernet Shiraz blend or something like that. And the Burgundies were no Pinot Noir within 100 miles. Medium-bodied, softer wines, usually Grenache-based. Okay. Grenache, or what we would now talk about as a GSM blend, or something like that. And then when we, as an industry, even though we'd been making wines for, more than 100 years, in the late 80s, when we started negotiating with the EU, we wanted to start, selling more wine around the world. And we signed an agreement with the European Union, bilateral trade agreement. And within that agreement, we agreed to stop using as a country, or at least phase out, all of the names which have a European origin: Burgundy, Champagne, Port, Sherry, etc., etc. Claret was one of them. Sure. Even though it's not a place, it still has it's an important part of the Bordeaux history, and so that was fine. So we started to use started to label varietally, and I think that there's probably not room in that story for everything to be told all at once, and for whatever reason Shiraz became the variety that was talked about more, maybe picked up more. I think if you think about what was happening in the early 90s, those really big voluptuous wines, usually with a fair bit of oak, were wowing people around the world. They made a real statement. Yes. Maybe the more subtle, food friendly, juicy wines that made from Grenache were, didn't make such a sort of a statement, and Shiraz became the hero. And now 25% of Australian grapes are Shiraz. 50% of the Barossa is Shiraz. Is still, and it's a really important. And when we could talk about Shiraz as well, of course, because of the the evolution of that. But in all of that, Grenache, just sort of plodded along. And when we first made our bushvine Grenache, I think the first vintage was 92. And there were only a couple of Grenache wines that you could buy in Australia at the time. I think Charlie Melton had a Grenache, and there were definitely a couple out of McLaren Vale, Jeff Merrill, and I'm sure I've forgotten one or two, but the Australians didn't know Grenache. They go, "What's this variety? We've never heard of it," even though they'd probably been drinking it, right, all their lives under some other name. As a variety, it just didn't have any traction, and it's taken quite a long time for for Australians and for the world to, understand it. And, they probably, a lot of people around the world have probably been drinking the beautiful wines, particularly of the Southern Rhone, for so long, and also not understanding they're drinking Grenache. Correct. So, that's all part of the education, isn't it, and that sort of story. But, I said to you, before that I think, Viognier is one of our most food-friendly varieties. The other one is Grenache, equally so.
Absolutely. It doesn't like to impose itself. It just wants to blend in to the meal, which is great. And I think that to add to that conversation, the future of Grenache is really bright, pardon the silly statement, because there is a movement inside, at least in the North American drinking populace, to move to lighter style wines, and it's a natural place for Australian Grenache to end up. And the love affair that obviously the winemakers have with it there isn't going to hurt either, because they seem to be putting a little extra attention and love towards that grape variety out of their own passions, which can't do any harm at all. No, well, Australian winemakers love drinking Grenache, and one of the reasons is because, there's always been plenty of it, because it hasn't been a big seller. But we do, it's such a beautiful wine to drink, and, I've always got, plenty of bottles of Grenache at home if I'm looking for something to drink. The other interesting thing that's happened with Grenache in Australia, and it's probably not making its way outside of Australia
all that much yet, although I suspect it will, and that's a big movement towards more rosé.
Mm-hmm.
So Australians traditionally have not been rosé drinkers or really rosé makers. 30 years ago, the few rosés that were in Australia were hot pink, sweet, lots of confectionery fruit.
Your version of White Zinfandel?
Yeah. These days, they're all pale, salmon coloured, dry, textural, very Provençal in their style. And there are a lot of them being made, and Grenache is, perfect for that. So, interestingly, I suspect we're not too far away now from getting a bit of a sort of a tussle between, what's going to be our preference? Is it rosé, or are we going to, the demand for our reds, more? So, that's a nice place to be, given, how long Grenache has, not had that demand. But it is a delightful style of wine to drink. And
cool.